the Middle East, الشرق الأوسط, המזרח התיכון, חבר העליונה, אורתודוקס. The one aspect of the Middle East that seems familiar to all of us is oil. Every time we buy gas or pay a heating bill, we're reminded of how dramatically the Middle Easterners have been pushing up the price of their oil over the last dozen years or so. The reaction of most people in the West to all this is one of resentment. These oil sheikhs have turned into millionaires overnight. It's our oil. Our technology discovered it. Without us, there wouldn't be any Middle Eastern oil. Is this a fair assessment? Well, there's some truth in it, but it completely leaves out the Middle Easterners' side of the story. First of all, it's not quite true to say that it was the Westerners who discovered oil in the Middle East, because the Middle Easterners have always known that it was there, ever since biblical times. In fact, the Old Testament is full of anecdotes about oil in one form or another, because you can hardly help noticing it. It's so near the surface that it just seeps out of the ground, all on its own, usually in the form of tar. It was the tar, or pitch, from the oil deposits in Iraq that God told Noah to use to make his ark watertight. Make thee an ark of gopher wood. Rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. There was plenty of tar in the Holy Land, too. Indeed, so much tar used to be washed up on the beaches of the Dead Sea that the Romans called it lacus asphaltites, the asphalt lake. There's even a Middle Eastern religion that may have incorporated oil into its rituals. In this case, Iranian oil. This is Zoroastrianism, the religion of the ancient Persians, whose priests tended eternal fires, as they still do today, symbolizing their belief in one God, Ahura Mazda, and in the purity of the elements. A likely explanation for the original fires that were venerated by the Zoroastrians is that they were oil flares, seepages of natural gas that had somehow become ignited and looked as if they could go on burning forever. So oil in its semi-solid form of tar, or in its vaporous form of gas, has always been part of the Middle Eastern environment. But it was a long time before people discovered how to make use of oil in its liquid form, because to do that, you first have to distill the crude oil into a more refined substance. And the way they found out how to do this was also tied in with religion. One of the fundamental ideas in the religion of the ancient Egyptians was the concept of the transformation of the human soul into its purest essence. In time, the Middle Easterners began to use a physical analogy for this: the purification of base metals into gold. This eventually developed into a quasi-religious science that the Arabs called alchemia, or alchemy. Later, the purification of metals into gold was extended to the purification of any substance into its essence. This is what led the medieval Muslims to look for ways to purify the crude oil that they found all around them in the Middle East. And in so doing, they perfected a technique for distilling this oil into a very refined fuel that could be used, among other things, as an illuminant in their lamps. It's interesting that the story of Aladdin probably originated at about this time, around the 9th century. The genie of the lamp promised untold riches. And though Aladdin's genie was imaginary, the refined oil that he might have used in his lamp was eventually to become a real genie of untold riches for the Middle Easterners. Because once you know how to refine oil, it has all sorts of commercial applications. And the Middle Easterners did put their oil to commercial use on a small scale. But they also passed on their secret of how to distill oil to the Western world via Spain in the 12th century. And here's where the West comes into the story of oil. Because as Western industry develops, there's a greater and greater demand for refined oil to lubricate and fuel all the new machines. At the same time, people develop the technical know-how for getting large quantities of oil out of the ground, which is what the Westerners first start doing in the United States, in Pennsylvania, in the 1860s. So this is where the commercial exploitation of oil really starts happening on a large scale. But of course, this might never have occurred at all if the Middle Easterners hadn't first discovered how to refine oil to the point where it could be used as fuel. So there were contributions from both sides. As for the large-scale development of oil in the Middle East itself, this really started with the British. And what triggered all this was the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. This linked the Mediterranean with the Red Sea, and now made it possible for British steamships to sail all the way from England to India via the Middle East, which was a much shorter trip than the old one around the southern tip of Africa. But the British steamships still had to burn a lot of coal to make the journey, and coal was getting more and more expensive. It would have been much cheaper to burn the oil which the Americans were now pumping out of the ground in Pennsylvania. But America was a long way to go to buy oil. And since the British were already in the Middle East, and since they too had noticed the traces of oil in the oil flares, they guessed that there must be large deposits of oil buried beneath the surface. So in the 1890s, they started looking for it in earnest. In 1908, at a place called Masjid Suleiman in Iran, they made their first major oil strike. From then on, there was strike after strike. First in other parts of Iran, and then in Iraq. And then all up and down the Persian Gulf, especially in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. By this time, the Dutch and the Americans and the French had gotten involved as well. And it was the French who were later to discover quite substantial oil and gas deposits in North Africa, in Algeria and Libya. There have been oil finds in many other parts of the Middle East as well, in Egypt and Turkey and Syria and Israel. But these are tiny in comparison with those in the Gulf region, where over 95% of all Middle East oil is located. Why is there so much oil in this part of the world? Well, where does oil come from? It comes from marine life, plankton, algae, and so on. Over millions of years, this organic material decomposes, and if the rock formations surrounding it fold together in a certain way, they gradually compress it, and eventually it's transformed into oil. The Gulf meets these geological conditions almost perfectly. The whole region once used to be part of a huge warm water sea, so there was an enormous amount of marine life in the area, hence the numerous oil fields that have formed here. In a sense, this is just one vast pool of petroleum, easily the largest reservoir of oil on Earth. It's now estimated that of all the world's known oil reserves, the Gulf region contains at least 65%. The only other regions that come anywhere near this are the Soviet Union, with about 15% of all known oil reserves, and the United States, which has roughly 5%. But not only is there a lot of oil in the Middle East, it's also very easy to get at, because unlike most of the world's oil fields, the Middle Eastern oil deposits lie very close to the surface. They are also under a great deal of pressure from the surrounding layers of rock, so that most Middle Eastern oil doesn't even have to be pumped out of the ground. You just punch a hole and the oil comes gushing out all on its own. There's another advantage. Most of the oil fields are quite near the coast, so the oil can be quickly piped to tankers in the Gulf and then shipped to any part of the world. So Middle Eastern oil is not only plentiful, it's also very cheap to produce. And as far as we can tell from present rates of consumption, there's enough to last for at least another 100 years, perhaps more. These are the untold riches that have been bestowed on the Middle Easterners in Aladdin-like fashion. But the Middle Easterners have not been the only ones to profit from these riches. In fact, for a long time, most of the profit went to the Western world. This is because the exploitation of Middle Eastern oil was linked from the start with the domination of the region by the Western imperialist powers. From 1908 until the 1960s, most of the Middle Eastern oil industry was under the very tight control of Western oil companies. As late as the end of the 1960s, many of these companies were still keeping at least 70% of all the Middle Eastern oil profits for themselves, and only giving about 30% to the oil-producing countries. So although quite a lot of oil money did flow into the Middle East in the early days, the lion's share of the profits went to the Western oil companies. Not only that, but in order to sell as much oil as they could, the oil companies kept the price as low as possible for a long time. A barrel of oil contains 42 US gallons. In 1910, the price of a barrel of oil from the Middle East was $1.20. For the next 40 years, this hardly increased at all. Not until 1950, when the price edged up to $1.70. And as late as the beginning of 1973, the price had still only increased to $2.60. The net result of all this was that from roughly the end of World War I until the beginning of the 1970s, not only did the Western oil companies in the Middle East become extremely rich, but the Western world as a whole enjoyed a seemingly endless supply of oil at remarkably low prices. In fact, this oil was so inexpensive that many economists maintain that much of the great material progress that the West has made over the last 60 or 70 years has to a large extent been based on cheap Middle Eastern oil. In a sense, we were being subsidized by the Middle Easterners. And we came to take all of this so much for granted that our oil consumption rocketed, reaching its peak at the end of the 1970s. Over the 10-year period, 1970 to 1980, we actually consumed more oil than in the entire previous history of the world. But by this time, we'd already received a very rude shock as the prices of Middle Eastern oil started to go up at an alarming rate. This began in 1973, when the oil-producing countries in the Middle East got together to take over their own oil industry and to force up the prices in a very drastic fashion. Prices quadrupled within less than 12 months. By the end of 1973, a barrel of Middle Eastern oil had gone from $2.60 to $11.65. And from then on, the price kept climbing until it reached a peak of $34 a barrel in 1981. So the oil sheiks have indeed been turned into millionaires overnight. But a lot of Western oil men had also been turned into millionaires prior to the 1970s. Now it's the Middle East's turn. But we shouldn't give the impression that everyone in the Middle East has become rich from oil. Far from it. As we've seen, the major oil fields are confined to the countries around the Gulf: Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states, and to two countries in North Africa, Libya and Algeria. But the rest of the Middle Eastern countries either have negligible amounts of oil or populations so large that their oil revenues are very small on a per capita basis. Sadly, the great majority of Middle Easterners are still extremely poor. There's probably no other region in the world with such a huge contrast between the rich and the poor countries. The per capita income of North Yemen, for instance, is about $500 a year. And sitting right next door is Saudi Arabia, with a per capita income of about $25,000 a year. Why don't the oil-rich countries in the Middle East share their wealth with the poorer countries? Well, to some extent they do. For example, the Arab oil producers give about 5% of their oil income directly to their less fortunate Arab neighbors in the form of grants and interest-free loans. And billions of dollars more are redistributed indirectly. The way this works is as follows. Most of the oil deposits in the Middle East happen to be found in the most barren and desolate parts of the region: Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states, and Libya. Until quite recently, these countries had tiny populations who led very traditional lives, remote from the modern world. This means that a large proportion of the new high-paying jobs that have been created by the oil boom have had to be performed by skilled immigrant workers from the more developed Arab countries in the Fertile Crescent. So, in addition to the aid that the oil states give directly to their fellow Arabs, a large amount of money is also contributed indirectly via the salaries paid to the immigrant workers, most of which they send home. Now, a lot of the oil wealth that is passed on to the other Arab states has political strings attached. But this is also true of aid from the West and from the socialist countries. Yet the fact remains that the oil-rich countries in the Middle East do give away a significant proportion of their incomes. But of course, the oil wealth can also be a mixed blessing. There are many development problems, not the least of which is the fact that most of the oil is in precisely those countries which lack the basic ingredients for building modern industrialized societies. They are located in very arid regions, they have small populations, and they possess few natural resources other than oil. Whereas countries such as Lebanon, Israel, and Turkey, which in many ways are much more advanced, with higher population densities and more congenial climates, unfortunately possess little or no oil. So, in a way, the oil has been bestowed on those countries least qualified to use it. As the Arabs themselves say cynically, God gives pistachios to those whose teeth can't crack them. But there is a further irony. By some quirk of nature, the oil fields not only coincide with emptiness, they also coincide with piety. Nearly all the oil-producing countries in the Middle East also happen to be strongholds of Islamic fundamentalism, whether we're talking about the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Libya, or Iran. Perhaps there ought to be a new proverb. God gives oil to those who love him most.